There's a specific kind of sound that a century-old limestone bridge makes when it collapses under the hydraulic crushing force of a modern excavator. It's not just a crunch, it's a groan, like the land itself is crying out in pain. And that sound, that terrible, heart-shredding sound, was the soundtrack to the worst morning of my life. Standing there, watching the dust settle over Ironwood Creek, was a woman named Victoria Sterling, the president of the Sovereign Hills Estates Homeowners Association. And she wasn't just watching, she was smiling, a tight, surgical expression that didn't reach her eyes, looking at the destruction of my family's history like she had just successfully scraped gum off the bottom of her designer heel. "It really is for the best, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass, completely ignoring the fact that she had just destroyed the only physical link I had left to my great-grandfather. That rustic aesthetic, it clashes with the modern serenity we're cultivating here. She called it rustic. I called it the blood, sweat, and tears of the Thorne family, carved into stone in 1927. But here's the thing about people like Victoria Sterling. People who view the world through the window of a Tesla and think checkbooks can rewrite history. They assume that just because an old rancher is tired, broke, and grieving, that means he's weak. She thought she had buried me under that rubble, but all she really did was clear the ground for a war she wasn't remotely qualified to fight. My name is Silas Thorne, and this is the story of how a luxury developer tore down my bridge, so I turned their gated community into a deserted island. To understand why I went to such extreme lengths, you have to understand the land, my ranch, the Ironclad, used to span over 2,500 acres of harsh, beautiful Montana wilderness, carved out by my great-grandfather Jedediah back in 1892. But time has a way of eroding empires, and after decades of droughts, market crashes, and the slow, agonizing medical bills that come when you try to save the love of your life from cancer, I was down to just 40 acres. 40 acres, a few dozen head of cattle, and that bridge. That bridge was everything. It was where I proposed to my late wife, Eleanor. It was where we carved our initials, SD plus ET, into the soft limestone railing. And after she passed 2 years ago, that bridge became my sanctuary, the only place where the crushing weight of $850,000 in medical debt felt a little lighter, because I could run my hand over her initials and feel like she was still there, watching the water flow. Then came the white Tesla. It was a Tuesday, the kind of crisp morning that usually makes you glad to be alive, when Victoria rolled up my gravel driveway, stepping out into the mud in a cream-colored power suit that probably cost more than my tractor, introducing herself with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining arithmetic to toddlers. "Mr. Thorne," she said, wrinkling her nose at the smell of honest manure, "we have a situation with your infrastructure." She handed me a folder thick enough to stop a bullet, explaining that a recent survey by the Sovereign Hills Board had discovered a clerical error, claiming my bridge, which had stood since before her grandfather was born, was technically encroaching on HOA common ground, creating an eyesore that lowered property values. "We're giving you 30 days to remove it," she said, handing me a list of approved demolition partners, including a card for Sterling Horizons, which just happened to be her husband's construction firm. "We can offer a family-friendly discount." I tried to be reasonable. I explained that without that bridge, I was cut off from my winter pastures, that building a detour would cost me 50 grand I didn't have. But she just clicked her pen, looking at me with dead eyes, and said, "Perhaps it's time to consider if ranching is really the right fit for this evolving neighborhood." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about a bridge. This was an eviction notice. But Victoria made a miscalculation. She assumed I was just a cowboy. She didn't know that 30 years ago, before I took over the ranch, I spent 5 years working as a records clerk in the county archives. And if there is one thing I know how to do better than brand a calf, it is digging through dusty, forgotten boxes in the basement of a courthouse. While she was sending her lawyers from Vanderbilt and Croft to threaten me with lawsuits that would bankrupt a small nation, I was down in the dark, breathing in mold spores, hunting for the original 1892 federal land grants. And I found it. The document was yellowed, brittle, and smelled like old tobacco, but it was clear as day. Ironwood Creek and a 30-foot easement on either bank were designated as federal agricultural access routes, protected by statutes that predate the existence of the state of Montana. let alone her cookie-cutter subdivision. I felt a surge of hope. I called my old buddy Jax, a former combat engineer turned water rights attorney, and he confirmed it. Silas, if they touch that bridge, they're not just violating property law, they're violating federal treaties. If you can prove the bridge is safe, they can't touch you. But Victoria wasn't playing by the rules. 3 days before the deadline, I woke up to the sound of metal on stone at 2 a.m., my security cameras catching 3 men in dark clothes taking sledgehammers to the foundation of my bridge, creating structural cracks that hadn't been there at sunset. The next morning, a county inspector, who I'd later learn played golf with Victoria's husband, declared the bridge an imminent public safety hazard requiring emergency demolition, bypassing all my legal injunctions. I stood there on that Friday morning, shaking with rage, holding the emergency order in one hand and my rifle in the other, watching the convoy of yellow machines rumble up the road, led by Victoria's Tesla. "It's for the greater good, Silas," she shouted over the roar of the diesel engines, flashing that victorious shark smile. "We can't have dangerous ruins threatening our children." They tore it down in less than an hour. I watched the stone railing with Eleanor's initials crumble into the water, disappearing into the muddy current of Ironwood Creek, and I felt a part of my soul snap right along with the masonry. As Victoria drove away, waving like a homecoming queen, she probably thought she had won. She probably thought the old man would just sell his land and die quietly in a nursing home. But as I stood there in the dust, listening to the silence where the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on stone used to be, I wasn't thinking about surrender. I was thinking about the 40 hours of audio I had recorded from the hidden microphones I'd placed near the property line, capturing her conspiring with the inspector to fabricate the damage. And I was thinking about something Jax had told me about agricultural water management. She wanted to play dirty? Fine. I was about to drag her into the mud. The weeks following the demolition were a masterclass in psychological warfare, executed with the precision of a drone strike. Victoria didn't just want my bridge gone. She wanted me gone. She wanted the smell of cows and the sight of my rusted pickup truck erased from her meticulously curated vista. It started small, anonymous complaints to the health department about unauthorized livestock odors, which is a fancy way of saying a ranch smells like a ranch, followed by the noise complaints every time I started my tractor before 8 a.m., and then the heavy artillery, insurance fraud investigations triggered by anonymous tips claiming my barn was a fire hazard. But the final straw, the moment that turned my blood into ice water, was when she went after Eleanor. I came home one evening to find a citation stuck to my front gate, demanding the removal of a non-permitted memorial structure, the simple wooden cross and stone bench I had placed by the creek where Eleanor loved to sit. Victoria had declared it garbage that violated the HOA's visual harmony code. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the blue light of the citation reflected in my eyes, and I called Jax. "I'm done playing defense," I told him, my voice so calm it scared me. "Tell me about the 1892 flow charts again." Jax drove up the next morning, bringing a friend, Dr. Elena Rios, a hydrologist who hated developers more than she hated poison ivy. We spread the maps out on my kitchen table, overlaying the modern Sovereign Hills blueprints on top of the original 1892 federal surveys. "Look at this," Elena said, tracing a blue line with her finger. "They didn't just build near the water, Silas. They moved the water." It turns out, to maximize the square footage for their McMansions, Sterling Horizons had illegally filled in the natural meander of Ironwood Creek, straightening it out like a canal. "This is a navigable waterway under federal law," Jax whispered, looking at the numbers on his calculator like he was seeing a ghost. "Altering it without Army Corps of Engineers approval is a felony. And the fines? Silas, the fines are cumulative. We're talking $37,000 per day, per structure." But I didn't want their money. I wanted them to feel the isolation they had forced on me. "What if," I asked, pouring coffee that was thick enough to chew, "I decided to restore the creek to its original, historical path, purely for agricultural irrigation and flood control, of course?" Elena looked at the map, then at me, and a slow, wicked grin spread across her face. "Well, legally, since you hold the original agricultural easement, you have the right to manage water flow for livestock. And if the original path just happens to encircle the entire development, it would turn Sovereign Hills into an island. Jax finished, his eyes widening. A literal island. We called it Operation Castaway. I recruited Buck Miller, an old war buddy who ran a heavy excavation company and had a grudge against the county for denying his permits years ago. When I told him the plan, he laughed so hard he nearly choked on his sandwich. You want me to dig a medieval moat around a bunch of Karens? Silas, I'll do it for free beer. We timed it perfectly. I filed the agricultural water restoration permits at 4:55 p.m. on a Friday, knowing the county clerk, a sweet woman named Betty who hated Victoria, wouldn't process the review until Tuesday morning. That gave us 72 hours of unmonitored operation. Saturday night, under the cover of a new moon, the monsters came out to play. Buck brought 3 massive excavators, positioning them at the strategic choke points where the creek used to flow before the developers raped the land. The sound of the engines was drowned out by the wind, and we worked with military efficiency, tearing through the earth, reopening the ancient channels that had been dry for decades. It was grueling work, mud slicking our boots, the smell of diesel mixing with the damp earth, but every bucket of dirt we moved felt like a prayer for Eleanor, a reclamation of the truth. By 4 a.m. on Sunday, the channels were dug, 12 feet wide, 6 feet deep. Then, we opened the floodgates. I stood on the hill as the sun began to rise, watching the water of Ironwood Creek rush into its ancestral home, roaring down the new channels with the force of pent-up justice. It surged around the perimeter of Sovereign Hills, cutting across the manicured lawns, severing the access roads, and completely encircling the development. At 7 a.m., the first scream echoed across the water. I raised my binoculars and saw Victoria Sterling standing on her back patio, yoga mat in hand, staring in absolute horror. Her perfectly landscaped backyard ended abruptly at a rushing river of brown water. She ran to the front of her house, only to find her driveway submerged under 4 feet of moving current. Her Tesla was effectively a submarine. By 8 a.m., the police sirens started wailing, but they stopped at the edge of my property because there was no way to get across. Deputy Callum, a good kid who knew the law, stood on the far bank, shouting across the water. Silas, what in God's name have you done? Just watering my cows, deputy. I shouted back, holding up my stamped federal permits. Restoring the natural watershed. It's all in the paperwork. Victoria was shrieking, wading into the mud in her expensive leggings, screaming about terrorism and kidnapping. You hillbilly psychopath. You've trapped us. This is illegal imprisonment. It's not imprisonment. Jax yelled from beside me, his lawyer voice booming. You're free to leave. You just might need a boat. Or maybe you can swim across the creek you claimed didn't exist. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Victoria had spent months proving the creek was just a drainage ditch so she could destroy my bridge. Now, that ditch was a raging river that had turned her exclusive community into Alcatraz. But Victoria wasn't done. She had money, she had connections, and she had a husband with a warehouse full of explosives. Tuesday night, the atmosphere shifted from chaotic to deadly. My security system alerted me to movement near the northern channel, the narrowest point of the moat. Grainy night vision footage showed 4 men from Sterling Horizons setting charges. They weren't just trying to fill the ditch. They were rigging dynamite to blow the embankment, a move that would have sent a catastrophic flash flood tearing through my barn and likely killed my livestock. This wasn't a property dispute anymore. This was domestic terrorism. I didn't call the sheriff. I called the FBI field office in Helena, sending them the video feed in real time along with the federal waterway statutes. When the federal agents descended, it looked like a scene from a blockbuster movie. Black SUVs, tactical gear, spotlights cutting through the darkness. They caught Victoria's husband holding the detonator. The look on Victoria's face as she watched her husband get shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the water she despised, was the first time I saw true fear in her eyes. But the final blow didn't land until the emergency town hall meeting 3 days later. The county commissioner, trying to save face, called a public hearing at the rec center. The room was packed, standing room only, ranchers in dusty hats on one side, furious HOA residents in polos on the other. Victoria, out on bail for conspiracy, took the podium. She looked haggard, her perfect hair fraying, her composure cracking. This man, she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me, is an environmental terrorist. He has destroyed property values and held good families hostage because he couldn't let go of a rotting pile of stones. She played a video montage of suffering residents having to be ferried across the water in rowboats to get their lattes. Then, it was my turn. I walked up to the microphone, placed a single heavy box on the table, and looked at the crowd. "I didn't destroy anything," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room. "I restored what was already there. But if we want to talk about destruction, let's talk about Sterling Horizons." I signaled Jax, and he projected the documents Dr. Rios had prepared. The falsified environmental reports, the bribed inspectors, the 1892 navigation maps, and then the audio recordings of Victoria mocking Eleanor's death, laughing about how my grief would make me easy to break. The room went silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a tornado. Then, the doors at the back opened, and Director Vance from the EPA walked in, flanked by 2 federal marshals. He didn't look happy. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice booming without a microphone. "Based on the evidence provided by Mr. Thorne, the EPA is seizing all assets related to Sovereign Hills to cover the cost of environmental restoration. You are currently in violation of the Clean Water Act to the tune of $300 million. He paused, letting the number hang there. "Furthermore, the demolition of Mr. Thorne's federally protected bridge is a felony. We are ordering the immediate reconstruction of the bridge at the expense of the HOA and the permanent recognition of the waterways as public land." Victoria didn't scream this time. She just slumped into her chair, looking small, defeated, and utterly alone. In the end, Victoria moved to Arizona, fleeing the shame and the lawsuits. Her husband went to federal prison for 3 years. The new HOA board, terrified of further fines, voted unanimously to rebuild my bridge, stone for stone, using historical craftsmen. Today, the bridge stands again. It's not the original, but the spirit is there. I carved SD+ET into the new railing, adding the date of the reconstruction. The moat remained, too. The state designated it a protected wetland. The irony is, it actually increased the property values of the remaining houses because it brought back the trout and the herons. Sovereign Hills is nicer now that the sharks are gone. I sit out there sometimes, watching the sun set over the water, listening to the creek flow around the island I made. And I ask myself, was it right? Was it justice to ruin a woman's life, to terrify a neighborhood, just to prove a point? Some folks say I went too far, that I was a vindictive old man who couldn't let go of the past. Others say I'm a hero who stood up to corporate bullying. I look at Eleanor's initials on the stone, and I think about the sound of that bridge falling, and honestly, I sleep just fine. But what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have dug the ditch?